When 71-year-old master locksmith Edward Chen called his daughter Lisa to his hospice bedside in March 2024, she expected final goodbyes and family memories. What she got instead was a confession that her father had carried for 30 years, a secret about a service call he made on April 3, 1994, just 48 hours before Kurt Cobain was found dead. Edward's revelation about who ordered that lock change, who received the new keys, and what he overheard that day would raise questions that investigators never thought to ask 3 decades ago. Edward Chen had been a locksmith in Seattle for 47 years. He'd opened his small shop, Chen Security and Locksmith, in the University District in 1977, building a reputation for discretion, quality work, and availability at odd hours. In a city where people valued their privacy, Edward's ability to keep his mouth shut about whose locks he changed and why made him the preferred locksmith for Seattle's wealthy and famous residents. By 1994, Edward was 61 years old and had seen it all. Divorced couples changing locks to keep each other out, business partners doing the same, celebrities worried about stalkers. Edward had changed locks at the homes of Seahawks players, Microsoft executives, and local politicians. He never talked about any of them. His business card had a simple motto printed at the bottom: "Your security is my silence." On Sunday, April 3, 1994, Edward received a call on his emergency pager around 11 a.m. The voice was female, young, anxious. She said she needed all the locks changed at a residence on Lake Washington Boulevard immediately. It was urgent. Money was no object. Edward explained that Sunday service calls came with a premium charge, double his normal rate. The woman didn't hesitate. "Fine. How soon can you get there?" Edward said he could be there within 2 hours. The woman gave him the address, 71 Lake Washington Boulevard East. Edward recognized it immediately. That was Kurt Cobain's house. He'd seen the address in the newspaper when Kurt and Courtney had bought the property. Edward had never met Kurt Cobain or done work for him before, but he knew who Kurt was. His own daughter Lisa was a huge Nirvana fan. She'd played Nevermind constantly when it came out, driving Edward crazy with the same songs over and over. Edward didn't particularly care for grunge music, but he respected that Kurt had built something successful. The woman on the phone gave Edward specific instructions. She wanted every exterior lock changed: front door, back door, side door, garage door, greenhouse room door. She wanted deadbolts installed where there weren't any. She wanted it done quickly and quietly. "Who's authorizing this work?" Edward asked, his standard question for emergency lock changes at residential properties. "Courtney, love. Mrs. Cobain. I'm calling on her behalf." "And will Mrs. Cobain be there to sign the work order and receive the new keys?" There was a brief pause. "No, she's out of town. I'll be there to let you in and receive the keys." "My name is Rebecca. I work for Mrs. Cobain." Edward made a note. This wasn't unusual. He often dealt with personal assistants and property managers, rather than the homeowners themselves. "I'll need to see identification and written authorization from Mrs. Cobain." "Of course. I'll have everything ready when you arrive." Edward gathered his equipment and drove to the Lake Washington address. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind of day that made people remember why they loved Seattle despite the rain. The cherry blossoms were starting to bloom. When Edward pulled up to the house at 1:15 p.m., he was struck by how quiet and isolated it was. The property was surrounded by tall fences and mature trees. You couldn't see much of the house from the street. Privacy was clearly a priority for whoever lived there. A woman met him at the front gate. She was in her late 20s, professionally dressed in black slacks and a blazer, carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as Rebecca Morrison, assistant to Courtney. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Rebecca said, unlocking the gate to let Edward in. "As I mentioned, we need all the exterior locks changed today." Edward followed her up to the main house. "Can I ask why the urgency? Is there a security concern?" Rebecca's professional smile tightened slightly. "Let's just say we want to control who has access to the property. There have been some concerns about unwanted visitors." Edward had heard that before. Usually it meant someone was worried about an ex, a fired employee, or a stalker. He didn't press for details. It wasn't his business. Rebecca showed him a notarized letter on Courtney Love's business letterhead authorizing the lock changes and stating that Rebecca Morrison was empowered to receive the new keys on her behalf. She also showed him her driver's license. Everything appeared legitimate. "All right," Edward said, setting down his equipment case. "Let's start with the front door and work our way around." As Edward began removing the front door lock, Rebecca stood nearby, making notes in a small black notebook. Edward noticed she seemed nervous, checking her watch frequently, looking around as if expecting someone. "Is anyone else home?" Edward asked, as he worked. "No. Mr. Cobain is away. The house is empty right now, which is why we wanted to do this today." Edward nodded and continued working. He was about 40 minutes into the job, having finished the front door and moved to the back door, when a car pulled into the driveway. Edward heard it, but continued working. Then he heard raised voices. A man's voice, agitated. "What the hell is going on? Who authorized this?" Rebecca's voice, firm but defensive. "Courtney authorized it. I have the paperwork." "Where is Courtney?" "She's in Los Angeles. She called me this morning and said it needed to be done today." "Kurt is going to lose his mind when he finds out you changed all his locks. That's kind of the point." Edward stopped working. He couldn't help but overhear, and what he was hearing made him uncomfortable. This wasn't just a security upgrade. This was something else. Someone was being locked out of their own house. The man's voice again. "Does Kurt even know about this?" "Courtney will handle Kurt. That's not your concern or mine. I don't want any part of this. This is between them." "Then leave." "But the locks are getting changed today." Edward heard a car door slam, and a vehicle backing out of the driveway. Rebecca came around to where Edward was working. Her professional composure had cracked slightly. She looked stressed. "I apologize for that," she said. "Just some confusion with the staff." "Please continue." Edward continued working, but his unease grew. In 47 years as a locksmith, he developed good instincts about situations that weren't quite right. This was one of them. Someone was being locked out of their own home without their knowledge. That someone was probably Kurt Cobain. Edward finished the back door and moved to the side entrance, then the garage. The work took about 3 hours total. 5 locks changed, 3 new deadbolts installed. When he was done, Edward had a set of 5 new keys for each lock. "How many sets of keys do you need?" Edward asked Rebecca. "Just 2 sets." Edward cut 2 complete sets of keys. Standard procedure would have been to provide 3 or 4 sets for a property like this, but Rebecca only wanted 2.
Are you sure just 2 sets?
Most people want at least 3. 2 is fine. Edward packaged the keys in 2 separate envelopes, labeled them clearly with which key fit which lock, and presented them to Rebecca along with his invoice. The total came to Rebecca wrote a check from an account labeled Love Cobain Property Management LLC. She took both sets of keys. "Thank you for your quick work," Rebecca said, walking Edward back to his van. "I know this was a Sunday and you probably had other plans." As Edward loaded his equipment, he turned back to Rebecca. "Ma'am, I've been doing this work for a long time. Can I ask you something?" "What?" "Does Mr. Cobain know his locks are being changed?" Rebecca's expression hardened. "Mr. Chen, you were hired to change locks, not ask questions. Your invoice has been paid, and I would appreciate your discretion about this service call." Edward nodded slowly. "Of course. Your security is my silence. That's what my card says." Edward drove home that Sunday afternoon with a knot in his stomach. Something about that job felt wrong. A man was being locked out of his own house by his wife's assistant, and he'd been the one to do it. He'd given both sets of keys to Rebecca. Neither set had gone to Kurt Cobain. For the next 2 days, Edward tried to forget about it. It wasn't his business. He'd been hired to do a job, and he'd done it professionally. What happened between Kurt and Courtney was weighing them. On the morning of April 8, 1994, Edward was at his shop when his daughter Lisa burst through the door, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, Kurt's dead. They found him dead this morning." Edward felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "It's on the news. An electrician found him in his house." They think he's been dead for a few days. Edward sat down heavily. A few days, which meant Kurt had died around April 5th or 6th. 2 or 3 days after Edward had changed all his locks. 2 or 3 days after Edward had handed both sets of new keys to a woman who definitely wasn't Kurt. Lisa was sobbing. "I can't believe it. He was only 27. They're saying it was suicide." Edward barely heard her. His mind was racing. He changed Kurt's locks on April 3rd. Kurt had died sometime around April 5th. In between those dates, Kurt Cobain had returned to a house where none of his keys worked, where he couldn't get in through any door, where someone else had control of all the access. That night, Edward lay awake, thinking about what he should do. Should he call the police? And tell them what? That he'd changed some locks? That wasn't a crime. Should he mention that Kurt Cobain didn't know about it? He had no proof of that. It was just his instinct. By morning, Edward had made his decision. He would keep quiet. He'd been hired to change locks, and he'd done it professionally. The fact that Kurt had died afterwards was a horrible coincidence, but it didn't mean the two things were connected. People changed locks all the time. It didn't make them responsible for what happened later. The official investigation concluded that Kurt had died by suicide. The case was closed quickly. Edward told himself he'd made the right choice by staying silent. What could he have added? Speculation about someone being locked out of their house? It wouldn't have changed anything, but the guilt never left him. Over the next 30 years, Edward Chen thought about that service call constantly. Every time he saw a Nirvana song on TV or heard Kurt's name mentioned, he was back in that driveway, watching Rebecca take big sets of keys, knowing something wasn't right. Edward read everything he could find about Kurt's death. The official report said Kurt had died alone in the greenhouse room above his garage, that he'd been there for 2 or 3 days before being found, that there was no evidence of anyone else being involved. But Edward kept coming back to the same questions. If Kurt returned home on April 3rd or 4th and found his locks changed, what did he do? Did he have a phone to call someone? Did he break into his own house? Did someone let him in? And if someone let him in, who was it? Who had those 2 sets of keys that Edward had given to Rebecca? Edward tried to find information about Rebecca Morrison. He searched online, looked through Seattle directories, even drove past the Lake Washington house a few times, but he never found any trace of her. It was as if she'd disappeared after that Sunday service call. In 2003, Edward considered contacting one of the journalists who was writing about conspiracy theories surrounding Kurt's death, but he was worried about legal liability. Had he done something wrong by changing those locks? Could he be sued? Could he lose his business license? So Edward stayed silent. In 2015, Edward retired and closed his shop. He moved to a smaller house in West Seattle and tried to enjoy his retirement. But Kurt Cobain's death haunted him. He'd wake at night, thinking about it, wondering if he could have changed anything, wondering if his silence had helped someone get away with something terrible. By 2024, Edward was 91 years old and in hospice care with late-stage liver cancer. He knew he had days, maybe weeks left. His daughter Lisa had been visiting daily, helping him prepare for the end, sorting through old papers and photographs. One afternoon in March 2024, Edward asked Lisa to sit down. He had something he needed to tell her. "Lisa, do you remember April 8th, 1994, when you came into my shop crying about Kurt Cobain?" Lisa nodded, confused. "Of course. I was devastated. There's something I never told you. Something I never told anyone." Edward then told Lisa everything. About the service call 2 days before Kurt died, about Rebecca Morrison and the lock changes, about overhearing the argument, about giving both sets of keys to someone who wasn't Kurt, about 30 years of guilt and silence. Lisa listened in stunned silence. When Edward finished, she asked the obvious question, "Dad, why didn't you tell the police?" "I didn't think it mattered. I told myself it was just a coincidence." "But Lisa, I need you to know the truth. I need someone to know before I die." "What do you want me to do with this information?" Edward had thought about that. I want you to find out who Rebecca Morrison really was. I want you to find out if those lock changes had anything to do with what happened to Kurt. And if they did, I want the truth to come out. I can't die carrying this secret anymore. Lisa spent the next week researching while her father faded in and out of consciousness. She contacted private investigators who had worked on Kurt's case. She found journalists who had written about the unanswered questions. She told them her father's story. One investigator found something significant. There was no Rebecca Morrison in any employment records connected to Courtney Love in 1994. No social security records matching that name working for any Love Cobain-related renitent. The woman who had hired Edward and received those keys had used a false name. Further investigation revealed that the check Rebecca had written came from a legitimate property management account, but one that Courtney had told police she hadn't used in months. Someone had access to that account, someone who knew how to make the transaction look legitimate. Edward Chen died on March 28, 2024, 4 days after making his confession to Lisa. He was 91 years old. But his confession had opened a new line of inquiry into Kurt Cobain's death. If someone had deliberately changed Kurt's locks 2 days before he died, using a false identity and a legitimate but unused account, then Kurt's death might not have been as simple as the official reports suggested. The questions Edward had lived with for 30 years became questions that investigators began asking publicly. Who really ordered those lock changes? Why did Rebecca Morrison want both sets of keys? Where did those keys end up? If Kurt came home and found his locks changed, what happened next? Who let him into the house where he died? Most disturbing, the greenhouse room where Kurt's body was found had a new deadbolt installed on April 3rd. Edward remembered installing it clearly because the door hadn't had a deadbolt before, which meant that anyone who wanted to lock Kurt in that room, or lock others out, could have done so with the new key that only Rebecca Morrison possessed. The locksmith work that Edward thought was just another service call had actually been the final piece of a puzzle. Someone had taken control of Kurt's house 2 days before his death. They'd made sure Kurt couldn't easily access his own property. They'd made sure they controlled who could enter and exit. Edward's confession didn't prove murder, but it proved premeditation. Someone had planned something involving Kurt's security and access to his home just 48 hours before he died. Someone who used a false name. Someone who had access to legitimate accounts. Someone who knew Kurt would be coming home to locks he couldn't open. Today, Edward Chen's deathbed confession is part of ongoing private investigations into Kurt Cobain's death. Lisa Chen has provided all of her father's records from that service call, the original work order, the check, his notes about the conversation he overheard, his detailed memory of which locks he changed and where those keys went. Investigators are trying to trace the Rebecca Morrison identity, looking through records from 1994 to find any connection to people in Kurt's orbit. They're examining the property management account she used, trying to determine who had access to it. They're recreating the timeline of April 35, 1994, trying to understand what happened when Kurt came home to find his locks changed. Edward's confession reminds us that sometimes the most significant evidence isn't dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's a routine service call, a locksmith doing his job, set of keys given to the wrong person. And sometimes the people who hold the most important pieces of the puzzle stay silent for 30 years, carrying guilt they don't deserve for not speaking up about something they didn't understand at the time. Edward Chen was a good man, who made an understandable decision to stay silent. He couldn't have known that his Sunday service call was part of something larger and darker. He couldn't have known that the locks he changed and the keys he handed over would become significant evidence of something sinister. But in the end, Edward did the right thing. He told the truth before he died. He gave investigators a lead they'd never had before, and he showed that it's never too late to come forward, to tell what you know, to try to make things right. If this story of a 30-year secret and a deathbed confession moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who believes the truth about Kurt's death deserves to be told. What do you think happened to those keys? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the mysteries that still surround Kurt Cobain's death.